I grabbed her, pulled her into the back of the van. And then she fought. She bit me hard, drew blood.
Do you use any kind of tourniquet on her, Tony? I mean,
Same thing.
What's what? I remember.
I don't recall. I just remember it was a yellow rope.
He got the thrill from watching his victims die. He had the control. He was, in his mind, godlike. He could grant life or grant death.
I felt like it was only a matter of time before the next body would show up.
Anthony Shore is about as smart as a serial killer is, as I've seen in 30+ years of criminal justice. You hate to say he is diabolically brilliant.
As detectives in Houston attend the latest discovery of a body, the relentlessness of the assassin's merciless handiwork begins to defy belief. The question arises, what could possibly be going on inside the mind of a serial killer?
She fought like hell.
Serial killers have a desire to kill. They have a thirst to kill.
Early one Houston morning, on her way to a school for troubled youngsters, fate introduced teenager Lori Lee Tremble to a man she was ill-equipped to deal with. He had driven past her before, spotted that she was often alone at a bus stop. Anthony Shore recalls that day as particularly memorable. The married father of two was a self-styled guy-next-door ordinary Joe, but he would reveal himself in recordings that we've obtained as a boy who girls would be uncomfortable with, a teenager who groped, and an adult who would kill and kill again.
Let's start with, at the start, just tell me.
First is Lori Tremble.
14 years old. Lori's 14 years old. I mean, think about your children who are 14 years old. I mean, it's unfathomable what happened to her. And she was just the first.
Lori Tremble, Tony Shore's first, as he calls her. By his version of events, she comes on to him.
One morning, this girl comes up and asks me for a cigarette while I was at the stoplight. I asked if she needed a ride, and I gave her a ride. And a couple days went by. She saw me. I gave her a ride again to school.
To school. The man claiming it was Lori Lee who was leading the 25-year-old Shore into a relationship knew she was at school.
She and I became more than friends.
He's trying very hard to make something that is very dark and sinister normal.
She and I became involved just in the sense of kissing and, hello, goodbyes. I started giving her a ride on a semi-regular basis.
He's trying to normalize the idea that he would pick up somebody else's child in the car, drive around with her, and that naturally one thing would lead to another.
Laurie is tall for her age, precocious, playing at appearing like a young woman, but focused on catching the 0641 bus every day and getting to class on time.
Laurie was walking to school, doing what thousands and millions of youngsters do every day. And here comes this predator.
Shore targeted them because of their vulnerability.
And one day it was misting rain. She saw me, asked me for a ride, and I wanted to get more involved in just the kissing and stuff. And it started off okay, and then she freaked out and said, "No, this ain't going anywhere." Let me out, threatened to tell on me.
There's something that really speaks to his need to be understood, this need to kind of rationalize and normalize and get the listener on his side. So even here, you're beginning to see those traits of narcissism, those traits of, you know, I can get you on my side, I can make you understand what happened, I can make you understand the stuff that is so unbelievably not understandable.
Shaw was married with 2 daughters, had a steady job, a nice home. He had a life. He had a lot to lose.
And what happened?
I undid her bra. Everything got out of hand. She freaked out, and we got into a fight. I tried to knock her out because I just really freaked out.
Shaw reached into the back of the vehicle for a cord that he'd left there.
I think the incident with little Laurie Lee really speaks to the premeditation and the boldness of this act. You know, he tries to make it out like, well, the cord just happened to be there. He knew this was something that he wanted to do. He places the cord in the car, ready for use.
I took this cotton cord and I tried to make sure that she would never, ever tell anybody, even though I knew that was insane, and I strangled her.
He got the thrill from watching his victims die. He had the control. He was, in his mind, godlike. He could grant life or grant death.
He had not perfected his method of killing yet, but according to homicide hunter Brian Harris, a 21-year Texas detective, part of the Tony Shaw modus operandi had been established. He killed with his bare hands.
The most personal way to kill somebody is to strangle them. It was personal and close, and so he was able to watch and literally watch the breath of life come out of that person.
Psychologist Dr. Linda Papadopoulos has been investigating the underlying symptoms and causes of Anthony Shaw's behavior. Her analysis is through the prism of his deeds. She's also had the benefit of hearing his story in his own recorded words, unearthed by this program.
When you think about the horror of witnessing a death, let alone being the cause of a slow death, you know, most human beings aren't capable of doing that, let alone taking enjoyment out of that, let alone focusing on what it means for them. You know, I kind of had to do it.
It's not right. I'm not justifying it. It's hard to talk about.
But hearing him say that, you know, this is hard to talk about makes you think, again, who is he thinking of? This is about him. He's talking about taking the life of a child, and yet it's turned on, oh, this process is difficult for me. It's all about him. And I think this ability to detach, this complete and utter lack of empathy, doesn't just speak to the horror of what he did, but the potential of what he might do in future.
The murder of Laurie Lee Tremble began just before daybreak. It's likely that she'd been snatched, assaulted, and killed in less than an hour. Her killer now had to dispose of the body. He drove to a nearby parking area behind a Mexican restaurant. Anthony Shaw had strangled Laurie Lee to death. Having dumped her body, he went back to work as a phone repairman and later that night played piano at a local jazz club where he was known as Tony, the telephone man. This is his music. In his mind, the mistake he had made was to hurt himself.
Anthony Shaw, with Laurie, used his fingers to strangle her, and he realized that his finger got hurt. When he was trying to strangle her, his finger got hurt, and so it was a learned behavior. He said, you know what, next time, I'm not going to have my finger in that position where it can hurt.
Shaw would devise a way to ensure his fingers would not be hurt. His method would one day earn him the mantle of the Tourniquet Killer. For now, he was not a suspect in the murder of Laurie Lee Tremble. He was free to kill again. In the late 80s, Anthony Shaw was working as a telephone repairman for Southwestern Bell in Houston. Married, he had 2 children and styled himself as Mr. Reliable, good-looking, a good neighbor, good company. But he was deft at deceit.
There's so many people coming out of the woodwork, particularly there's some people that contacted me that worked for the phone company who were just astonished, and they were dumbfounded. They said, I worked with him. I know him. I went to lunch with Anthony. Sure. I can't believe that's him. He was so nice, such a normal guy.
There were large gaps in time where nobody knows what Anthony Shaw was doing. Even his wife didn't know, or his family.
That's what makes serial killers so difficult to capture. That's what makes serial killers so difficult to recognize, because they're your next door neighbors, they're your coworkers.
One of the things that makes Shaw so dangerous was that he really was the guy next door. And it's that cliche when you find out, you know, the horror, and you hear everyone say, but really, like this is the Tony the telephone guy.
Shaw was, I think, a master of lying and secrets and disguises and things that covered his trail.
But if the truth of Shaw's past had been known to anyone in authority, he would have been a suspect in the murder of Laurie Lee.
His sisters speak about the fact that he was sexually inappropriate and indeed sexually aggressive with their friends. So he would touch them when they didn't want to be touched. He would try and make them feel uncomfortable.
He was a groper. Sometimes it could start off as simple as somebody in an elevator and they like the fact that they can bump up against a stranger and get away with it. Anthony was that kind of person. He would bump up against people, he would grope people and see how he could get away with it.
In his mind, there wasn't a woman that was exempt from sexual harassment. If he was in an elevator and he was aroused, he'd sexually harass the woman in the elevator. If he was at home and his sister brought home a friend, he would sexually harass the friend. You know, there was such a sense of entitlement over the way that he saw women. He engaged with them as objects to be used for his sexual satisfaction.
Years followed the murder of Laurie Lee Tremble without a breakthrough. In 1992, Shaw's habit was to drive through a part of Houston every day which saw him pass a girl at a bus stop. She was 21-year-old Carmen Maria de la Estrada. Some called her Maria, others Carmen.
And I ran across this really, I thought, beautiful young lady, and I offered her a ride. And she turned me down. Said she was on my way to work every morning.
Out of all the victims, one of the more interesting stories of Anthony Shaw is what he believes was a relationship with Carmen. He describes Carmen as somebody that came to him, that wanted him, that this was a willing relationship.
She was going places. She was talking about, yeah, she wanted to go out.
In his own mind, Anthony Shaw, for whatever reason, really had an affinity for Carmen. Carmen was his pet. Carmen was his prize. And he liked Carmen, so therefore he didn't refer to her the way he did the other victims.
I think what's particularly dangerous about Anthony Shore was the fact that he constructed these narratives in his mind that fed into this fantasy world. So with Carmen, he believes that they're in a real relationship.
When Anthony Shore discusses Carmen, he seems to revel in the fact that Carmen wanted him. That this wasn't a case of him having to abduct any kind of woman or force Carmen to be with him. That he had this physical proudness that she came to him.
So her need to kind of keep him at bay and say no doesn't really mean no in his mind. In his mind, it means, well, just wait. I really want this, but maybe not now. So any attempt by a young woman to reject him, to put down parameters, is kind of met with complete disregard. She's beautiful, he wants her, well, that's it. He'll have her, even if he needs to completely violate her and potentially even kill her.
She was, again, you know, a hard worker, trying to help her family, you know, just taking public transportation to and from her work and just helping her family just go about life. And here she was again, vulnerable, by herself, no one else around. And here comes Anthony Shore again, seizing that opportunity.
Shore does not feel Carmen's fear. He understands only his perception of events, consoles himself that this is a romantic liaison.
I remember I opened her blouse and she was resisting. So then I had this sick consumption that I was going to have her regardless. I wanted to possess her somehow. And my intention was to have sex with her initially, and that wasn't happening. She became real violent, just fighting, wanting to get out of the car.
He begins to fear that, hold on a second, she's going to tell on me.
Shore knows all too well what the reality now is. A woman he attacks is trying to break free. He reacts the same way that he had years earlier with Laurie Lee.
Abducts her, rapes her, kills her in excruciating slow fashion, and then dumps her.
And he speaks about this as if he has no choice, as if his safety obviously trumps any need for her to have a life, to grow up, to get married, to breathe.
I remember I had a pair of shears, and she had on black shorts. I took them off. And her pantyhose, but I didn't cut her panties. I don't know why.
It's like he's relaying a run-of-the-mill event. It's like he's relaying what happened on the way to work, you know, as if he kind of accidentally stepped into a puddle.
It got out of hand, and she freaked out, and I knew this was not. This was going to be real bad. So I panicked.
And this is truly telling of his lack of empathy, even though he tries to use words like, oh, you know, it was horrible, it shouldn't have happened. There's very little true empathy there.
It started to become daylight. So to avoid discovery, again, I strangled her.
In the case of Laurie Lee, Shore had hurt his fingers when attacking her. With Carmen Estrada, he used a weapon, one which still enabled him to slowly squeeze the life out of her.
So what does he do? He gets a tourniquet. And it becomes his signature card, his calling card, and he gets good at it. And with that tourniquet, with every twist, he can tighten it and watch them start to die, loosen it, give them a gasp of air.
The tourniquet takes your fingers off the pulse, literally, but it gave Shore the ability to turn life on and off by controlling the airflow of the victim. And it heightens the anxiety and pain and fear of the suffering victim.
Shaw has never been one to avoid the limelight. Some believe his choice of weapon was a means of gaining notoriety.
I can't say for sure, but I think in Anthony Shaw's mind, he was probably thinking, what will separate me from other serial killers that no one else has done? Aha, I can strangle my victims to death with a handmade tourniquet, and hence you get branded as the Tourniquet Killer, a name that stuck with him throughout his criminal career.
He seemed to take pride, a sick kind of pride in his killing and in his technique with the tourniquet. It worked for him. It was his signature.
He's able to really enjoy the killing. He ensures that she dies slowly. He ensures that she dies on his terms. The horror of this is completely lost on him.
Shaw is not the typical low-functioning, one bad crime defendant. He was a calculated, thinking, predatory killer.
The discovery of Carmen Maria de la Strada's body did yield a piece of evidence which would one day prove crucial in the case against Anthony Shaw.
DNA was found underneath her fingernails.
The problem was, it was early days in DNA technology, and what sample detectives had did not match any on the Texas database. The murder of Carmen was not linked to that of Laurie Lee. Laurie hadn't been raped. Carmen was. Laurie had been strangled whilst Shaw had used a tourniquet to kill Carmen. Different MOs. And there were 6 years between the crimes. 18 months after the murder of Carmen Estrada, Shaw was still working in plain sight of those that he targeted. No young woman was safe in Houston.
Well, here's a guy that worked for the phone company, telephone company, Southwestern Bell, as a repairman. I mean, that gives him access to, you know, so many different parts of town where you can basically spy on so many different people throughout the day.
He had access to every neighborhood in Houston. He had a reason to be there. He had a marked vehicle. It made it totally easy for him to just look for victims.
In October the following year, 18 months after Shaw had killed Carmen, he spotted a girl coming and going from a house.
I'm guessing she was probably 16, 17 at the time. I'm not really sure how old.
The victim was a young person whose house he surveilled for several days.
She was young, she was attractive, and I was a phone man working outdoors, outside plant. And I worked down this street several times. I'd seen her coming home. I knew that she was a latchkey kid coming home from high school or whatever school she was going to.
To me, this is so methodically calculated on his part as to how he picked his victims, and then, of course, what he did to his victims afterward. This was not some spontaneous spur of the moment. This was somebody who was so devious and so cunning in nature.
Having broken into the house where the teenage girl lived, he waited until she returned from school. She entered. He pounced.
Told her it was a burglary, got her cooperation, and tied her up with electrical cord and raped her.
The young lady fought the way Laurie Lee and Carmen had. Shaw had killed them. Would he let his latest victim survive? Bound with duct tape, threatened with a knife, the latest victim of Anthony Shaw does not become his third murder victim. As he strangled her, he claims to have realized the wrong that he'd done.
Well, and I thought, no, I just can't. I just need to get out of here. And I left. Thank God.
But you didn't strangle her at all, or you started to?
I started to, and I stopped.
He speaks about it in the same way that you'd speak about trying to, I don't know, to quit smoking. It's not a big deal, you know. It's a behavior I'd like to stop, and you know, it's an addiction that'd be really nice if I kind of stopped. Again, this isn't a person. This is a thing to be used, and if I could just use it in a different way, then I'd be better. So there's no sense of the impact this would have had on this young woman. There's no sense of the pathology behind, you know, wrapping her up in duct tape, letting her suffer all that. You know, he sees this as a great win for himself because, hey, I didn't kill this one.
He considered it an accomplishment to be able to rape women without murdering them.
It was around noon in August, a year after Shaw had raped but not killed a teenage girl, that 9-year-old Diana Rabola left her home. She was the same age as Shaw's youngest daughter. Diana's errand that day was to fetch sugar for the family to sweeten their homemade watermelon drinks.
Her mom simply sent her a block away to go to the store.
We're not talking about someone walking, you know, in the dark, after hours. We're talking about the middle of the day in a neighborhood. We're not talking about some isolated area where there's no, this is a populated part of the town. That's pretty brazen.
Shaw shows no pity as he recounts events that day, complaining that his victim had shown tenacity in defending herself.
She fought like hell. Strangely, she fought like hell.
She was sexually tortured and just dumped like the rest of them.
Just wouldn't go along with anything. And she was so afraid.
You know, someone that can do that to a 9-year-old girl without any care in the world and just leave her out there just to rot. It's about the lowest of the low you could possibly imagine of a life form in this universe.
And she fought and fought. And I don't recall what type of cord or strand or piece of wire or something. And I did the same thing.
But if you look at Diana, he's got to explain why he chose her. So he talks about being the nice guy, that he always gave her little rides here and there, and that's why she would just hop in with him. Couldn't be farthest from the truth. Her mother didn't raise her that way. And Anthony Shore couldn't even give the family the dignity that they raised their daughter better than to just constantly hop in a car with a grown man. This was Anthony Shore taking advantage of a 9-year-old girl that he had no explanation on why he would snatch her off the street.
Shaw had now killed 3 times, but was still not a suspect. The murder of Diana Rabola was a turning point of sorts in the Shaw storyline. Publicly, Houston police did not admit they had a serial killer in their midst, but privately, they did.
As a young line prosecutor, I worked in the Special Crimes Division of the Harris County District Attorney's Office, which I now lead. And pre-DNA, 1992 through 1994, when it was very uncommon for it to be tested, there were a series of crimes involving a signature mark, a tourniquet, left on the bodies. And 2 of those cases came across my desk. They were brought by homicide investigators who were working the cases, trying to figure out the whodunit.
The police were now looking at those on the registered sex offender list, but Shaw wasn't on that list. In 1995, a girl went missing in Houston. Her name, Dana Sanchez.
Last and final case, Dana Sanchez.
Middle of the day, minding her own business, not doing anything wrong, not doing anything illegal, just doing what teenage girls do, you know? And again, the one common denominator all 4 of his victims had, besides being young, were they were by themselves. And little did they know that how vulnerable that made them to a sadistic predator like Anthony Shore.
I was driving around. I saw this girl I want to say she was wearing white coveralls and a striped shirt underneath.
Dana goes to make a phone call. In the days of telephone booths, she's just going to make a phone call. What a perfect victim for Anthony Shore. He's the phone man. He's the guy that's there. And she's outside, and she just wants to get a ride.
And she was mad. She had this look that she was angry and upset, and she was at a payphone.
She needs a quick ride, and here's somebody that perhaps she's seen in the neighborhood before. She's seen certainly repairman. This guy's doesn't look like much of a threat. I mean, my goodness, he must be at work. So she's very trusting. And that's one thing Anthony Shore made note of, that all the victims were very trusting, and Dana trusted him for a ride.
One night I just said, hey, would you like a ride? She says, man, I'm going to see my boyfriend somewhere. I forget where she told me. I said, no problem. And jumped right in. And we went driving. And then we had conversation.
As with others he had chosen, Dana was Hispanic in appearance, slight of build.
Anthony Shore chose his victims primarily based on their size, of course. All of them were small in stature, thin.
I was flirting with her heavily. That time I had really long hair. I thought I looked good. Maybe I just looked like a freak. I don't know. But she was real friendly, you know, talking about, I think she said she was a runaway.
If you go and look at someone like Shore, how many countless hours he must have just roamed around. I mean, I can't imagine this being spontaneous. I mean, to me, this is so methodically calculated on his part as to how he picked his victims, and then, of course, what he did to his victims afterward. This was not some spontaneous spur of the moment.
In fact, despite his claims, it's all but certain that Dana resisted Shore from the moment that he approached her.
She was joking like, no, I got a boyfriend and this and that. So I grabbed her, pulled her into the back of the van. And then she fought. She bit me hard, drew blood, I forget, from my chest, I want to say. Mm-hmm. So I restrained her, tied her hands.
Twice.
I want to say duct tape. I don't remember for sure, but I think duct tape. I remember that I taped her
Right.
face. And she was fighting so hard. I knew there was nothing I could do to get out of this. And I used a ligature.
Shore drove to a deserted area nearby and dumped Dana's body in scrubland, his signature tourniquet abandoned by her body.
I didn't throw in a dumpster this time. I drove around somewhere away.
Dana was reported missing by her friends. Days turned into weeks and still no sign of her. Police needed a break, and they got one via a telephone tips hotline. They could not have known it, but it was Anthony Shore himself who made the call. There are those who believe he wanted the notoriety.
So he has the audacity to contact a local news station and tip them off as to where the body could be found, just so he can make sure that he got credit for the latest murder in his own mind. That's mine. You can actually visualize him at home in front of the television, waiting for the local news to capture the story of what he did, and him just salivating, going, "Yep, that's another one of mine."
At the time, there was no match to the DNA found on police records.
So you have this great DNA evidence from this body in a field that you can't compare it to anything because there's nothing in the system to compare it to.
Around this time, Houston police did arrest Anthony Shaw, 7 months after Sanchez's murder. But he stayed cool. It was a misdemeanor arrest. An undercover officer posing as a prostitute randomly offered Shaw sex for a fee, and he accepted. He was given 3 months unsupervised probation and a $122 fine. No DNA sample was taken. It would take another heinous offense for Houston police to get their man. Over the decades that Shaw would spend talking to police, he aged, losing the long hair he thought had made him look so good. By 1997, Shaw had remarried. His mother and sister looked after his 2 daughters, but his readiness to terrorize women and young girls never left him.
All of a sudden, Anthony Shaw does another despicable act when he sexually abuses and assaults his 2 young daughters.
Because the laws had changed and DNA samples could and were taken from individuals charged with certain crimes, a law that didn't exist back in 1992 or 1994 when I investigated those other cases. Because of that, his sample was entered into CODIS, the national system for matching DNA to known individuals or unknown individuals.
Shaw would eventually plead guilty to child molestation. He did not go to prison.
He's arrested, convicted, put on probation like many sex offenders are, particularly on your first offense, so that's not a surprise. He was put on probation. But the catch was, and this led to his downfall, he had to submit DNA as a result of now being a convicted sex offender.
And when his sample was entered into the CODIS database, it matched the old capital murders.
In almost a strange, cathartic way, his daughters ends up solving the murders of the 4 young girls, because if he hadn't committed those atrocities, the abuses on his daughter, who knows how long, who knows if it would have ever been solved. It's hard to say. So in a strange way, his family became his downfall.
But it didn't happen overnight. Because of administrative failures, it took 6 years from the arrest of Shaw for sexually molesting his daughters to match his DNA to that found under the fingernails of Carmen Estrada. 11 hours into his police interview, he confessed. In 2004, now showing the signs of being an older man, Shaw was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death by lethal injection for his role in the killing of Carmen Maria de la Estrada, while in the course of committing aggravated sexual assault. Shaw also confessed to the murders of Lori Lee Tremble, Diana Rabola and Dana Sanchez, as well as the aggravated sexual assault of a 14-year-old student. Shaw asked for and received the death penalty. Not that his story was even remotely over.
He's the only inmate whose case I've reviewed where his own family asked that he be executed. His sister, his children, it says a lot about him.
But during his years on death row, Shaw embarked on a game of cat and mouse with the authorities by hinting at other crimes he may have committed, so forcing them to open cold case files.
He confessed to a number of alleged rapes that he said he committed on women that he met in social settings or bars, where he would slip them Rohypnol, the date rape drug, take them to his van, rape them, sometimes sell them to others, and then deliver them back, supposedly without them knowing what had happened to them. You know, it's hard to know what to believe from a serial killer, but It's easy to imagine other victims because Shore was prolific, but he was calculated.
Anthony Shore was still on death row at the beginning of 2018, 14 years after he was sentenced. At the start of the year, his time looked to be up. Kim Ogg is the district attorney who pursued the death sentence in the case of Tony Shore. She's known to be reticent in the use of capital punishment.
Well, when the government exercises the greatest power it has, which is to kill a citizen, it always has to be taken with great care. It's the most serious act our government commits.
What was it then that made even those slow to see the use of the ultimate state penalty like Kim Ogg to pursue the execution of Anthony Shore?
I thought that we would always be in danger from Anthony Shore, and taking a look at his victims in the waiting room with them before the execution. These were broken people, and I think the future dangerousness is that every breath that man took caused those families pain, including his own family, who testified and told the media they wanted him dead.
Shore even claimed to have murdered a man for whom another prisoner on death row had already been convicted. His story wasn't true. He claimed other rapes. The seriousness of those claims kept him alive for another 90 days as investigations were launched.
And he got a 90-day reprieve in order to look at all the, quote, offenses he was claiming credit to, just to make sure and determine that he indeed didn't commit any further murders and rapes.
Finally, Shore's game of claiming crimes to his name to avoid execution ended. He was put to death by lethal injection on January the 18th, 2018.
Anthony Shore's the worst of the worst. Serial murderer, torturer, enjoyer of other people's pain and suffering, murderer of little children and women, the kind of guy who we can never be safe enough from.
Every time I tell myself, I just kept saying, man, this gotta stop. I'm a sick puppy.